Yes, I'm Jacquelyn McCroskey. I'm a professor in Los Angeles, California, the USC School of Social Work. Been there a long time. And I've been involved with lots and lots of efforts around trying to improve our government systems in the state, but particularly in the county of Los Angeles. So I was particularly intrigued to meet Chris when he was on making his round the world voyage to discover what else was going on in terms of child welfare, to find that we had a lot of interests in common and we had a lot of experiences to compare. So my husband and I were planning a vacation trip, and so we thought we might as well come by Brisbane. So this is like, all right, so I'm not doing anything very formal. I'm just going to talk, and I will, because people were asking me about slides and so forth. I'm like, yeah, no. I didn't bring slides on my vacation, but I will talk to you a little bit, and then I'm very happy to take questions. I'm hoping that we can have a discussion because that's always the most interesting part. So to get started, just even if we went around the room and you told me your names and your organizations, I would not remember them. But I'm just interested in, so how many of you are actually working in government agencies? Okay. NGOs? Anybody else? Pretty much who we got here. Universities, yay! We try to be applied sometimes. So how many of you have been working in, I'm assuming you're all pretty much work in child protection in that area, right? How many of you have been working in the field for like 10 years or more? 20 years or more? Okay, so I'm not going to tell you a lot of stuff you don't already know. But what I find is really, really helpful, and one of the reasons I love to get the opportunity to talk to people who do very similar work to the kind of work that I do in other countries, is that you're following along, you completely get what they're saying, and then all of a sudden there's like what, you think about it like that? That's really interesting, and so I find when you share so much, but then when you reach the points of assumptions that I've been making that other people don't necessarily make, turns out to be perhaps the most illuminating part of such conversations. So I'm hoping we'll have at least a few of those that we can discuss afterwards. So Chris did give me some materials to look at, and I found them interesting because they look familiar to me, but they also look a little bit different. And so one of them was I'm sure you guys can cite this chapter and verse, the Taking Responsibility Report, the Roadmap for Queensland Child Protection. And this one I found really interesting because, well, I'll tell you in a minute, but in Los Angeles, we've had a similar inquiry recently. And so I immediately flipped to the back to see how many recommendations there were. And I was very impressed. There are 121 recommendations. And having been involved in these kinds of efforts before, then I also like the Road to Renewal Senior Leaders Forum one, because if you're a senior leader of an organization that's trying to implement 121 things, you will go crazy pretty soon. And so you try to group those things into clusters that make a certain sense. And so this one also looked familiar to me because it tried to group things into, but which are the key recommendations, or which one are the ones we have to do first in order to be able to accomplish the others. And this one got it down to 34. I'm not such a quantifier that I have to quantify everything, but as I mentioned, we've recently had what we call a Blue Ribbon Commission in the County of Los Angeles look at our child protective services system. They just finished their report, made their report to our elected officials, our Board of Supervisors, in June, and are now moving to implementation. And so both of these documents look familiar to me. And we ended up in our report this time only having about 40 recommendations. And that was because we tried to only have 5. So the announcement was, we are not going to cover everything. We are really going to highlight the major things that need to be done in order to set the system on a different path, and we're going to limit the scope of what we're doing here, and we'll only have 5 key things to do. But it's, as you guys know as well as I do, the nature of child protection is you can't do that. Because for a lot of reasons, but I just want to sort of, talk a little bit about what I think of as some of the underlying realities in child protection. One is that these systems are political, both in the sense of capital P and small p, and I'm never quite sure which is the capital and which is the small, but there's electoral politics, and child protection is very, very much engaged with whoever the elected officials are at the moment in time that such reassessments take place. But they also hit home for all of us. They're kind of at the core to anyone's life is their family life and their community relationships. And so they're political in every sense there is. And when you've got such a political topic, you aren't going to come up with one simple set of suggestions. There is no way to fix a system that is at its essence political with a simple set of recommendations or suggestions. The other thing that's just so apparent, and I'm sure you've all experienced it too, is that we not only all come at it from our own personal experiences, what happened in my family and when I was a child, what happened to my children, what happened to the children of the people I know, it hits home at a deeply emotional level for every one of us, although in a different emotional way, depending on what our experiences were, and maybe even how old our kids are right now, and so forth and so on. So it has that, but it also has people from very different professional backgrounds involved. So you've got disciplinary lenses that people come to this with that are like, okay, here's what you have to fix. And we just noticed that so much in LA County's recent, what we called our Blue Ribbon Commission, because the Board of Supervisors basically appointed someone to represent law enforcement, someone to represent health services, someone to represent mental health services, someone to represent the child protective services, et cetera. And so and they sat on this podium and had this years worth of discussions, basically. You could literally see people talk past each other. And what we tend to do in those situations is basically to say, okay, we'll get one or a set of recommendations for the law enforcement people, we'll get one or a set of recommendations for the health people, we'll get one or a set, there's one for you, there's one for you, there's one for you, and there's one for me. And so we end up with these longer lists, even if we don't necessarily want to. And you also have different vantage points, as you know, and that's partially why I was asking you about sort of where you sit now. If you sit in government and you know it's going to be on your shoulders to help implement these things, or if you're in the NGO sector and you know that you're going to, your life is going to change based on what comes out of these things. If you're a parent of a child who's been removed, et cetera, where you sit, not just disciplinarily, but kind of what role you play in these systems also changes how you see things. And so we seemingly always we end up with regular inquiries because none of us have yet figured out the way to make child protection immune to tragedy, immune to mistakes, immune to difficulties of all kinds. And when those tragedies and mistakes and difficulties come up, that we're looking for some way to say, okay, we're often looking for somewhere to point the finger. We're looking for people to blame, but we're also looking for ways to fix things. And so we bring together these inquiries and air what different people see from their different perspectives as the most important fixes that need to be made, which makes perfect sense, but it makes it awfully hard to implement, doesn't it? And so you have a certain periodicity of this. What we've had in Los Angeles, I'll just lay a little bit of groundwork for it, is basically 30 years ago, we had a Blue Ribbon Commission which created our Department of Children and Family Services. And there have been a couple of inquiries in between, but this most recent one that happened just this year was kind of the bookmark, maybe the end of a period, the end of a time frame of creating a department with a specialized responsibility for child protection is going to solve all of our problems, and all we have to do is get that department to work right. If we could get that department to work right, if we could stop rotating directors, if we could get some stability in top management, if we could get it. I think we, as a community, but certainly our Board of Supervisors kind of went, this department is not going to be the be-all and the end-all. We have, in California, you have 58 counties, and the counties are responsible for health and human safety. And so it's really at the county level that the human services are administered. And we've got such a fragmented array of different departments, each of which has some role to play in the lives of communities, families, and children. And so what the Board of Supervisors was trying to say was, it doesn't matter how super our super department becomes, if you don't have the connections with the other key services, with the other county departments that also play such important roles in the lives of our communities, we're not going to get there from here. And if we don't have government working more effectively with communities, NGOs, yes, we call them CBOs, community-based organizations, but with actual communities, with residents in communities, not just with people who work in community-based organizations. If we can't make those connections tighter, we're not going to be able to get there from here. I think that there's certain similarities. Los Angeles is about 10 million people. It's, as I said, one of 58 counties, so it's a very large metropolitan jurisdiction. It's really spread out. The resources for families and children are not spread out where the families and children live. Lots and lots and lots of residential mobility, lots and lots and lots of immigration, documented or otherwise, and just very different departmental philosophies and ideas and so forth. So it is very, very, very possible as a family who's facing poverty and stress and trauma and all kinds of other things, that you're basically not going to have any help from the social services sector until you get reported to the Department of Children and Family Services. It's an easy place to get lost in. It's not a place where everybody knows their neighbors. It's not a place where everybody feels comfortable, helping somebody else negotiate systems. So it's not that different, really, from any other large urban jurisdiction, but we all think we're different, right, in some ways, and we actually are different in some ways. It's trying to figure out what we can learn from each other that's really the challenge, where we have similarities and where we have differences. So what the major recommendations that are coming out of this report, this attempt to change our child protection system, are number one, a structural change. And so what this commission has recommended is, rather than having a Department of Children and Family Services and then a section of the mental health department directed towards mental health services, or required by the courts to provide mental health services to the children in the child protective services system, and our substance abuse services for families who come in contact with the system in the Department of Public Health, and the health services for the kids in who are in this system in the Department of Health Services, and so forth and so on and so on, that they want to create a structure that's multi-departmental, calling it an Office of Child Protection. And we're trying to hire what our favorite investigative reporter in the LA Times insists on calling a children's czar, which all of us in the field hate that term, because we're like, who would that be? Oh my God. But we're trying to create an oversight layer which can facilitate the the kinds of integrated services that we've been talking about for at least 20 years, but haven't really gotten to yet. So that's one of the key changes, and there's a really interesting discussion going on about, but what budget authority and what actual lines of authority in terms of staff would this Office of Child Protection, is it a ombudsman kind of thing, right? Where you're basically just watching what's going on and saying, yeah, we like that, no, we don't like that. Or is this really gonna be your boss's boss? Or the department head's gonna really report to this new layer of authority? Nobody knows yet. But what I think are particularly interesting recommendations that we're also trying to sort through right now. One of them is a shared mission for maintaining the safety and well-being of children across county departments to begin with, but across county government and community. That having a shared mission that's clear what the mission is and that everybody contributes to it would be, it's not the be all and the end all. But right now we clearly have the opposite of that. What we have is each department head is responsible for their budget and their employees and their reporting up to the elected officials, and they don't have any authority over the services that the families and kids actually need that all reside in different departments. So at least if we move towards a shared mission, then we have an opportunity for shared metrics, shared measures. So if we say this is the mission and we start to quantify achievement of that mission in ways that clearly involve each of those departments making a contribution, we'll be well ahead of where we are now. So it's very, very interesting. It's very, very, after a time of great discouragement and great disbelief in the ability of our child protective services system to pull itself up by its bootstraps, where now we're trying to move towards, we've got a shared responsibility for pulling this up. Easier said than done, though, right? As I'm sure you know. So my personal experience in Los Angeles County as a kind of I always say have 1 foot inside government, 1 foot outside government. I am a professor at USC, but I have worked with our Department of Children and Family Services and other county departments, including the juvenile justice sector, for about 30 years. So I've seen a lot of efforts at these same kinds of achievements over time. And what I've seen that actually makes a difference, basically, is the effective use of data. Using data to measure change and to monitor contributions to change. I'm going to talk a little bit in a minute more about data. It's hard to do. But it's only when you can say, yes, remember that global vision we came up with? This sounded very familiar to me, PeakCare. It's not exactly the same mission statement, but very close to one that we would use. But then you try to move down a level and say, and who's supposed to do what in order to achieve that vision, and how do we know that we're accomplishing what we're aiming for? How do we get our aspirations to at least begin to come in line with our achievements, so that we can do the continuous improvement that we all want to do. So I'm going to talk, as I said, a little bit more about data in just a minute. But the other thing that I have seen work in Los Angeles County is multiple iterations of shared visions. So you don't, when you start off with a not homogeneous community and a not homogeneous set of agencies, saying we're going to have a shared vision is one thing, but actually working out the kinks in that and what it actually means for everybody is something that happens over time. It doesn't happen because you say, and now we have done it, and now we have a shared vision. And so we've been working on it 20 years or so in multiple iterations. and I think are probably better than many places in terms of you know, being actually able to, we're closer to being able to achieve what we all want. But as you guys well know, in systems that have, where people have different roles and different disciplinary allegiances and different languages and different experiences, et cetera, that's not a small change. It's a huge change, and it takes place over time, and it takes place in iterations. And it also takes place very concretely. It's when you have shared tasks that you actually figure out who can do what and how. And so we've had a lot of different efforts at trying to do that, but each time it really does get better. It really does get better. And also, I've got to say, honestly, each time certain people say, I really can't stand any more of that, we're, you know, just can't do that. But as long as we can frame the task in a way that I can see what my contribution is to it, and I can see how I cannot do this alone. I could not do this by my agency or by my university or by my, certainly not on my lonesome, but I can see how it can't be done well unless I'm part of the process. And you just get better and better at working out the interpersonal and the cross-organizational relationships. So those are the two things I've seen work, so that's why I'm pleased that this new report sort of highlights both of those. It says, we have to share this responsibility, and we have to concretize the ways in which we're sharing it, and we have to try to come up with measures that will let everybody know, that everybody agrees to begin with, no surprises, but that will let everybody know where we're actually achieving and what we're achieving, what we're able to do and what we're not able to do. The one thing I forgot to mention, and I'll just bring it up briefly, because the former, as one of the former Commonwealth countries, it's also really interesting how much kind of our assumptions about what these services are shaped by the original, by the Elizabethan Poor Laws and sort of other kind of basic elements of creating our community-based service systems. But in the US, we may have a slightly different, I don't know, you can tell me, slightly different, I call them 3 roots of child protective services. Basically what we had was the settlement house route, which I'm sure you guys all know about. I don't know the history of settlement houses in Australia, but that was a set of beliefs which said it's social turmoil, it's economic turmoil, it's changes in the world that put families at a disadvantage. And the only way that families are going to be able to support their children and raise themselves up is to get a little help in times of need when social turmoil is so extreme. So that was one of the roots of our current child welfare practice. The other was the charity organization societies, which basically was the roots of casework. It's the problems are in the individuals or in the families, and what is required is, we used to call a friendly visitor, somebody who would come in and sort of set you straight on really how your family should be working from here on out. And so obviously in the social work profession, we've still got a lot of that. We probably have more of that than of the settlement house philosophy, but we try to maintain both of those roots. And the third one is one that, this is where I'm not sure if Australia has anything similar to it. It's a more, in the US, it's the Societies for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. And in our big eastern seaboard cities, they used to call them the cruelty, and they were basically law enforcement officers who went into tenement houses, and their role was to scare parents. And sometimes take a child and remove them so that everybody else would see what they should not be doing. And we still have all 3 of those in our child protective services system. I always say to my students, you can hear almost any meeting you go to, you can hear echoes of all three of those things in almost any meeting, and some days you can hear echoes in yourself of all three of those things, because they each have a certain reality base, right? And they have all contributed to our ideas about what protecting children requires. Sometimes it requires a strong arm and a clear set of guidelines. This is how we're going to do it. This is how we do it. And if you're not going to do it that way, then and sometimes it requires let me help you with what's going on inside your household. Let's talk about what's going on inside your household. Is there a better way to do that? Is there some other resources that we could get for you that could help you do that more effectively? And sometimes it's wait, we've just had huge unemployment in this community. We've got hurricanes or tsunamis or whatever else might happen, natural disasters, and nobody's going to do it all by themselves. So those are three roots that add an interesting tension to the world of child protection, because you're never quite sure which viewpoint is going to come up in any particular discussion, or in any, as I say, sometimes for yourself, you're not quite sure which viewpoint you're going to take in a particular situation. So I also know that you're very much grappling with the kind of, I don't know if they're new ideas exactly, but the sort of the most current ideas in a lot of that are affecting child protective services, I think, all over the world. One of them is neuroscience. So we're learning so much from neuroscience. The growth in terms of scientific studies and new knowledge that people need to take in is astronomical. And I can at least speak for the US. I can't speak for Australia. I have no idea. But social work is way behind the curve in this. We're really not understanding how this new science dramatically changes the way we think about our jobs. And in particular in child protective services, at least I can tell you in California, we do a kind of a little training. Let's do your 2-hour training on brain architecture, right? But we don't help practitioners figure out what that means. Okay, so now I know that relationships are key to forming neural synapses, and that the brain cells get pruned over time if they're not used. And I can tell you a little bit about gene expression and so forth and so on. But what does that mean when I see this family, or when I see families coming in with very young children and so forth and so on? It's a world that we're not yet really part of, and we need to become part of it, because it has huge implications for long-term well-being. And not only for a single generation, because now we know that the gene expression is influenced by experiences, right? As I said to somebody the other day, there's no argument, is it nature or nurture anymore? We can show you that it's both. The chemical reactions that allow the genes to express themselves are either enhanced or decreased through experiences, in particular early childhood experiences a long time ago. That sort of adds to other research we've had, like the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, and stuff. Things that social workers have some familiarity with, but we're not. We haven't fully integrated into our practice. So that's one set of things that's really interesting. Another one that's really interesting, and I know from talking to Chris and Sue today that you guys are also engaged in discussions about collective impact. What does that actually mean? And it turns out that it's pretty interesting. In, for example, situations like I was talking about in LA County, where we have this report that says we have to have a shared mission. And having a shared mission isn't enough. Then you have to have an agreement on how you're going to measure accomplishment of that mission. And then you have to have metrics that enable you to continuously improve. You don't just have your annual report on, did we hit our numbers? You have to continually be talking to each other and sharing your experiences about why or why not are we being able to hit our numbers, et cetera. And then I think one of the more interesting parts about this whole set of ideas is the idea of the people who are most directly involved in these shared processes can't do it all by themselves. Because you get so hung up in the interpersonal and interorganizational relationship issues that you need somebody to stand outside a little bit and hold a mirror up to you and reflect a little bit and say, what just happened there? So this idea, they talk about the backbone organization, some sort of credible external group who can say that, this part seems to be going great. What are we doing about this? What's really happening there? So that whole set of ideas about collective impact, and certainly, I would say in the U.S., it's a meme, about memes, the ideas that kind of contagious. That's gone very far in the philanthropic sector. I doubt there are very many conferences held by philanthropy that don't focus on collective impact, but you won't hear it very often in the government sector. When they're holding big meetings about how we're going to work with you as our community, they're not talking about collective impact usually. But it has great potential in terms of how government works with NGOs and communities, I believe. And then I'm just going to talk a little bit more about data, because that's really my thing, is data. So we had for about 18 years something that we called the Children's Planning Council in LA County government, and it was basically made up of representatives from the key county departments that provided services for kids and families, and then representatives of key community groups and professional associations and so forth. The biggest challenge was figuring out who sat on it, because you couldn't hold the meetings in a convention center, and you had to figure out a way that people felt heard and so forth. But we went for 18 years. It was pretty good. And one of the ways we anchored that work is we developed what we call 5 outcome areas, 5 key things, that domains of well-being for children that everybody thought were important. And we had a children's scorecard that we put out every 2 years that said, and how do we quantify our accomplishments for the population as a whole in Los Angeles County, as well as for the kids who are most likely to come to the attention of county government. And so we made multiple improvements every time we put that out, maybe 9 or 10 times. We also had what we called a children's budget, which was, and where is all the money coming from for the services for children and families? So within county government, of the 34 departments, about 15 of them provide services to kids and families, and each of those departments every year on their annual budget request had to specify which programs were for children and families, and then we got to the point where we had performance measures around those, et cetera. So we had 2 documents. One was basically how are the kids doing, and the other was, and what are the resources we're spending? And obviously the important connection was, and are the resources in the right place in order to improve the indicators that we see need improvement. So I worked on that effort for, 20 years or so, a long time. And we're just about to reinvent a new children's scorecard for a new day, and it's going to be web-based and interactive and have layers of data underneath the indicators, and we're hoping all kinds of cool stuff. But the other thing that I have done for a long time is I'm an evaluator. I work with my colleagues from other universities and from government and CBOs who are doing new programs and try to figure out what data do we have to tell us the impact. This is very much, I've done one RCT, randomized controlled trial, but mostly we're trying to get real-time data, or as close to real-time data as we can for improvement. And so the project that I'm working on now, which I'm really excited about with the partner at my school, the USC School of Social Work, her name is Emily Putnam-Hornstein, is we've developed something we call the Children's Data Network. It's funded with philanthropic dollars, but the idea is to link administrative data sets across silos in order to harvest the scientific potential of what we can learn about improving policy and programs. So we are partnering with both state agencies who collect data, county agencies who collect data, and something called the Child Welfare Indicators Project, which is at UC Berkeley, which has been tracking progress in the Child Protective Services system for 10 years, 15 years, maybe. We're just in the first year of this Children's Data Network, but we have what we think is the beginnings of a cool website. So it's www.datanetwork.org. You can look at it and see if you agree with me that it's cool. But it's a very interesting opportunity now because you can, rather than focusing only on the battles between government agencies of who's going to share what data with whom in real time, we're looking at research. And so we are we're protecting human subjects, we have IRB reviews, we have all kinds of things at the university level, and we are looking at identifiable data in order to be able to connect records, to link records across systems, but then destroying the identifiable data and having a number, basically. And so researchers will only have access to non-identifiable data in order to look at what do we know about how children progress across systems. So we're about to come out with one of our first reports, and I'll just sort of titillate your interest in that. We're looking at, because we started with Child Protective Services records, birth records, and death records, we can look at, of all children born in the state of California, how many come in contact with Child Protective Services during the first 5 years of life. Because we've done a lot of that work, we're not fully there yet, but we've done a lot of that work. Basically in California, it's about 15.5% of all children born in 2006 and 7, so we took one birth cohort of those 2 years. Of all the children born in California in those 2 years, about 15.5% had a referral to Child Protective Services. And in Los Angeles County, it's about the same, about 15.5%, and that's because LA County is by far the biggest county in the state of California, and our numbers tend to, on average, look the same as the state. But what we're also looking at is sub-geographic levels in LA, so we can say, and what's the variation across regions of our county? Because as somebody who's been looking at data around kids in LA for a long time, I can tell you that there's generally more variation within LA County than there is between LA and the rest of the state. Because it's a very big place, we've got high desert, we've got Malibu, we've got Hollywood, we've got South Central. Those are really different places, and the rates are really quite different. So in our high desert area, overall it's 21% of all babies born in 2006 and 7. There's a report to Child Protective Services. And in South Central, it's about 20%. And in West LA, which is right by the beach, so you can imagine, about 8%. So it's just an initial, it's a start, but it's a way, what we're trying to do is to demonstrate to people that if you put together data we've already collected, and you look at it with an eye to, and how do we improve policy? What do we learn from data we're already collecting as to how do we improve our shared efforts to improve policies that benefit all children and families? There's a lot we can learn from work that's already going on. So I'm going to stop talking there and see if anybody has any questions.
I actually work as a counsellor, and I mean, it's a bit of seeing, maybe I might be seeing things through the lens that I see everything through, but in counselling there's a lot of evidence now that the more you get feedback from the clients into the counselling process, so you draw them into a reflective process to talk about the counselling, the better outcomes you get for counselling.
Right.
And it's a related question to this lady's question
right.
too, and to what you've been talking about data. Is that, is what you're talking about that where you draw people into a reflective, any practitioners into a reflective process, that's when you start to get some sort of success. And it doesn't matter what you set goals around or what the goals are, as long as people are actually reflecting on the goals and trying to achieve something, then you start to get a collaborative success. Is that, am I just sticking something through my lens? Or?
No, in this early set of studies I was just talking about, we found out, this is like completely shocking, that where the worker and the family agreed on what they were working on, they were more likely to be successful. Shocking. But I don't know. I can't explain why that mindset is so antithetical to much of child protection. And I guess it's partially because we haven't really been pressed to demonstrate our outcomes before. We were seen more as a function that a society has to have, more an investigative one, more really towards the law enforcement side of things, right? Not towards the self-realization or reflection side of things. And I'm sure you have that here too, but you, having just sat through this whole series of hearings of this Blue Ribbon Commission, the thing that was just the most heart-wrenching about the whole thing is that families who had been wrenched apart by the Child Protective Services system organized themselves and were at every hearing, and we had sunshine laws where you have to have public comment, right? And so you'd have this very high-level abstract conversation amongst the commissioners, and then they come to public comment, and you would have the same people pretty much getting up over and over and talking about, but what happened to my son? My son was sexually abused while in care. What did you do to me when I was a child? You did the same thing when you came in and took my child away. I mean, just this sense of such division between the function we think we're fulfilling for society and some people's reflections on what we're actually achieving. It's very, very painful. So that may be one of the reasons why it seems so hard to get there.
At the beginning about the dynamics, I guess, of inquiries, and it is linked to that question we were commenting about data, but I guess in Queensland we've had 3 inquiries in less than 15 years, and we've got a national inquiry currently running, so you could count that as 4, I guess.
Yeah.
And each has had a different emphasis, different focus, and it has been in some ways, then particularly last inquiry in Queensland, it was like watching public hearings where it was a war being played out between the professional groups and through their submissions and so on. So there was this underlying fist fight going on between different professions in some ways to see who would gain the ascendancy about different philosophies about it.
Yep.
And I guess some of the core, it was interesting that, whether an inquiry can ever do this, or whether it is a continual evolution and we need to look at other ways of promoting the evolution in a healthy and constructive manner. But certainly the kind of outcomes we measure and the data, and taking on board what you're saying, is that almost inadvertently inquiries have produced very poor outcomes because of interpretation and a value base that's applied to the implementation of those. And certainly the current one, the most recent Queensland one, the Commissioner did actually wrestle with a lot of core concepts. A lot of the time he spent wrestling with what is this thing called child protection, where does it begin and end, and its relationship with other systems and so on. Wrestled a lot with issues about, okay, so it's based on the parents' willingness and ability of parenting, whereas the state's responsibility to enable, not just their ability, but then to enable. But the other core concept I think that we no further ahead with, and I'm a bit disappointed he didn't take it on as much as he said he intended to, was around core concepts of best interests of a child. So inadvertently, I think, in the previous inquiry, best interests of a child was put up as a predominant agenda. Its result was the pitting of a child's interests against the family's interests, the parents' interests, and that in particular disadvantaged Aboriginal families, I think, and led to particular philosophies around by the statutory agency towards child protection. And so I guess I'm thinking about what you're saying. You know, is there some lesson to be learned about approaching this in a different way to understand this is an evolving concept, to guard against the inadvertent consequences of inevitably a values base in how we measure outcomes, and depending on what you think is good or bad, and your values based to that, it is about depending on your interpretation, one outcome can be regarded as a good thing by someone, another outcome
Yep.
a bad thing by someone else.
Yep.
And that's going to keep evolving and changing and being interpreted, I guess. So I don't know the answer to that, but it's been in my head that we spend an awful lot of money on inquiries that, really is just about pendulum swinging instead of like, let's move this on. I don't know the answer to it.
Right, and I certainly don't know the answer to it, but you're absolutely right that what I didn't talk about is what sparks the inquiry at that moment is going to frame most of what can happen from it, right? So, as in most cases, ours was a tragic death where it was clear the departments were not communicating with each other, and so that's why a lot of the focus ended up being on this. And we had a chairman of this panel who had been our former director of the Department of Children and Family Services in LA County, so he was very familiar with how things worked. And the reason he left, basically, he got a really good job that paid a lot more, but he was also so frustrated by his inability as head of Child Protective Services to command any resources for mental health services, for families, for substance abuse services, for, all of those other things that are really at the core of a lot of enabling you to get to determining which families we really need to work with, right? If child welfare becomes the first door that people get to rather than a much smaller channel to, right? So that was the frame, which I think, I thought was really helpful because as a frame, because it's something that government struggles with all the time. It's I don't know, we got Max Weber, whoever we have to blame for bureaucracy, right? But one of the things that's really clear is which line of command are you in? And how far down are you? What's your reporting structure, et cetera? And so this was all about, no, that's not the issue. The issue is this whole picture, right? And so the downside certainly is that it raises expectations. So it took the pressure off, honestly, it took the pressure off our Board of Supervisors, 5 people, who had been the subject of many LA Times investigative reports. They're not doing anything, they don't care, et cetera, right? But that inevitably raises expectations, right? Because everybody looks at this elephant and sees the piece of it they see, and they think, oh, they're gonna fix my piece. And somebody, any one of us, anyone who attended any meeting, any of those meetings, could point to somewhere in the transcript where they specifically said what you want fixed, right? So if they don't fix what I want fixed, this is not useful. That's the nature of those kinds of inquiries, and maybe it's just, the democratic system, you got to recognize you're always going to have these multiple perspectives, and what these things signal is kind of okay guys, we heard you. Something new has got to happen, and we here, leaders of your community, are sitting in front of you with TV cameras on us and everything else saying, we hear you, something's got to happen. In our case, our Board of Supervisors actually said in public, part of the problem is us, which was like, even though they said part of, that was big, but they aren't going to accomplish all those things because now you move into a completely different set of things, right? Now you move into implementing those 121 or 34 or 42 or whatever it is. And the more literal you are about implementing those 131 or whatever, the less likely you are to be successful in actually changing the condition that you set out to change, to make this overall system more effective. The more you focus on doing these particular things we could agree on, the less likely, because that's a continuous improvement process. That's not a, okay, we did that one, we've all seen those, you know. Yes, let us out from under this lawsuit, let us out from under this, advisory committee, whatever. We did all the things you told us to do. Our kids are still not better off, but we did all those things you told us to do. It's easy to get discouraged in this business, right? And I'm like really going, okay, I don't want to leave you feeling worse than you did when you came in here. What can I say? Yikes, I don't know how to pull this one out. I guess the major thing is to say you have this wonderful opportunity. The opportunity of an inquiry is that it's kind of all up for grabs. I know there's 122 things, but it's sort of, honestly, what that means is it's all up for grabs. And so there's going to be some big changes happening that gives you guys opportunities that you haven't had before from wherever you sit. And the more that you can identify other places or other, analogous situations, that you know what you're advocating for. And the more that you can build consensus or build connections or build relationships around what you're advocating for, the more likely you are to be able to take advantage of this opportunity. Because even if it's only every 5 years, that means 4 years in between when you don't have that same openness, that same fluidity. So it is a big opportunity, and there certainly are many, many places around the world who go through the same cycle. And so to the extent that you can say, we may not agree on everything, and I'm happy to argue with you all the things you don't agree with me on, but if we could come to a few things we do agree on, we might be able to make some real progress here.